In a world where billionaires play gods, where entire nations are treated like laboratories, one man dared to say no. From the deserts of the Sahel to the streets of Ouagadougou, his defiance would ignite a fire across Africa and shake the foundations of the powerful. This is not just a story of politics. It is a story of betrayal, mystery, and courage. A story of a soldier who stood against giants. A story of Ibrahim Traore and the day he shut down Bill Gates's GMO Mosquito plan. If you believe Africa's voice must be heard, if you stand for freedom and sovereignty, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Night in West Africa is never truly silent. The crickets chirp, the wind carries whispers through the fields, and the hum of distant generators cuts the darkness like a pulse. But on this night, another sound joined them. The low growl of unmarked trucks rolling across dusty roads under a moonless sky. Their cargo, strange metal crates stamped with a single emblem, a mosquito etched in silver. Locals who caught sight of the convoy spoke in hushed tones. "What is inside?" one elder whispered. "Medicine, or a curse?" No answers came, only soldiers escorting the shipment like treasure. The convoy vanished into a makeshift facility on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Behind locked fences and armed guards, the first trials began. Western media would soon hail it as the dawn of salvation. "A breakthrough against malaria," they proclaimed. Slick videos showed smiling African children, their lives supposedly saved by science. Yet in the villages near the testing grounds, shadows deepened. Cattle fell sick overnight. Strange. Fevers spread among families who had never before been touched by malaria. Some swore they saw swarms moving unnaturally, as if commanded. And in the presidential office of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore sat in silence. Before him lay a classified dossier, GMO Mosquito deployment, approved by Global Health Initiative. The pages detailed a plan that stretched far beyond his borders, a biological experiment disguised as mercy. His eyes hardened as he closed the file. For weeks he had ignored the whispers. But now, with the truth before him, there could be no more denial. The world was watching. His people were afraid. And what he did next would shock the world. Ibrahim Traore had risen not through fortune, but through fire. A soldier forged in hardship, his uniform carried the weight of generations betrayed by promises from abroad. He had studied the patterns of history, how aid always came with chains, how independence was only granted on paper, how men like Thomas Sankara had been silenced for daring to dream of self-reliance. The struggle was never abstract. It lived in the faces of his people. Burkina Faso was no stranger to malaria. Families buried children every rainy season. Mosquito nets were scarce, medicine expensive, and clinics overwhelmed. Death had become routine, so when whispers of a miracle solution arrived, many clung to it like hope itself. Bill Gates's philanthropic empire painted a glowing picture. Genetically engineered mosquitoes, incapable of carrying malaria, would breed and spread, cutting the disease at its source. The narrative was seductive, a future free of suffering, a war won without bullets. International NGOs descended with banners and slogans urging acceptance. "This is science for humanity," they declared. But Traoré was not convinced. Hope, he knew, was the most dangerous weapon in foreign hands. He ordered his advisors to dig deeper, and what they unearthed was troubling. The project was not solely a humanitarian endeavor. Behind the health foundations were biotech companies with military contracts, corporations filing patents that granted ownership not just over modified insects, but over their offspring, their genetic legacy. It was as if someone intended to patent life itself. Still, the pressure mounted. Global envoys praised Burkina Faso as a testing ground. They promised funding, technology, and prestige. Behind the polished smiles, however, were threats. Refusal meant being painted as anti-science, backward, unworthy of global trust. The IMF began to tighten its grip subtly, hinting that loans and relief might vanish. The United Nations dangled aid on one condition: compliance. Inside his own cabinet, the fractures widened. Some ministers argued for acceptance, desperate for resources to combat malaria. Others warned that once foreign genes entered their ecosystem, there would be no return. Traoré listened, but spoke little. He was studying, calculating, watching the movements of those who pressed him hardest. In the villages, rumors spread, faster than any official report. A farmer's herd died mysteriously days after the mosquito crates arrived. Children developed fevers unlike anything the doctors recognized. The people began to speak of a curse, swarms that appeared in unnatural numbers, mosquitoes that did not bite yet hovered endlessly, as though searching for something unseen. Fear became a fog over the countryside. And through it, foreign scientists continued their work, insisting it was all coincidence, all paranoia. Trust the science, they repeated. But for many Burkinabe, trust had been buried long ago with the bones of those lost to foreign experiments. For Traoré, doubt became certainty when he received an anonymous envelope. Inside, a leaked document stamped confidential from one of the corporations funding the mosquito project. Its words were chilling. The engineered mosquitoes were designed not just to stop malaria, but to carry traceable genetic signatures. In essence, every population exposed could be monitored, mapped, even influenced on a genetic level. It was no longer about health. It was control. He stared at the papers for hours, his office lit only by the flickering of a desk lamp. Beyond his walls, the city hummed with unrest, whispers of rebellion and conspiracy filling the night air. But inside, one thought consumed him. If they succeed here, Africa will never be free. From that night, the weight of decision bore down heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He knew the road ahead would not be won with diplomacy or negotiation. He would be forced to stand against the richest man on earth, the most powerful institutions in the world, and the very narrative of progress itself. And yet, somewhere within the silence of that office, another truth stirred. He was ready. The rains came late that year. When they finally arrived, they did not bring life, but dread. Across the farmlands of Burkina Faso, crops withered strangely. Corn stalks bent as if poisoned by unseen hands. Livestock wasted away, their carcasses littering dry riverbeds. Yet it was not drought alone that plagued the land. It was something more sinister. Villagers spoke of mosquitoes appearing in clouds thicker than ever before, not just at dusk, not just at night, but in broad daylight, swarming fields, clinging to walls, filling the air like smoke. Mothers kept their children inside, fanning them desperately, yet still the fevers spread. These fevers were different too, not the long-known rhythm of malaria, but something sharper, unpredictable. Children convulsed, men fell unconscious, Women miscarried in silence. Foreign scientists, flown in under the banners of NGOs, dismissed it as panic. These are natural fluctuations, they said. Coincidences of climate. Yet in their guarded labs, whispers told otherwise. Leaked reports spoke of mutations, of altered genes spreading faster than predicted, of effects they could not contain. And Ibrahim Traore knew. Every morning, new reports piled onto his desk. Rural protests, markets emptied by fear, clinics overwhelmed. Families burned mosquito nets in rage, believing them cursed. Others turned against local officials accused of selling the people to foreigners. Tension smoldered in every province, but it was not only the countryside. The pressure came from beyond Africa's borders. Letters arrived from international organizations, wrapped in the polite language of diplomacy, but carrying the weight of threats. The IMF froze negotiations for critical loans, citing instability. The World Bank delayed agricultural support. Western embassies whispered of consequences. Behind closed doors, his intelligence officers revealed the truth. Burkina Faso was being strangled into compliance, and at the center of it all stood the mosquito. The divided generals inside Traoré's war council, the fractures widened. His eye, generals, men forged in battle, were now torn apart by a war unlike any they had faced. One group urged pragmatism. Accept the program, they argued. Take the aid, take the technology. Our people are dying. We cannot fight hunger with pride. Their voices were heavy with desperation, some perhaps with greed. Another group, fewer but fiercer, warned of betrayal. This is not aid. This is a weapon. Can you not see? They bring sickness, not salvation. Traoré sat at the head of the long wooden table, silent. His eyes scanned the maps, the reports, the photographs of dead cattle and sick children. His silence was heavier than words. One general, known for his loyalty, leaned closer and whispered, "Captain, remember Sankara. He was killed for less than this. They will not forgive defiance." The name hung in the air like a ghost. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once dared to defy foreign powers, who dreamed of African self-reliance, who was gunned down by betrayal. His spirit haunted every decision Traoré made. Would history repeat itself? The whistleblower, it was then that a shadow entered the story. A man known only as Dr. Keita, a Burkina-based scientist who had worked with the foreign team. He vanished for weeks before reappearing at the gates of the presidential palace, gaunt, terrified, carrying a single flash drive. What it contained would unravel everything. The files revealed that the GMO mosquitoes were not merely engineered to block malaria. Hidden within their DNA was a lattice of synthetic markers, genetic codes traceable by satellite-linked sensors. Entire populations, once exposed, could be tracked biologically. Movements could be monitored, not by phone signals or documents, but by the very blood in their veins. Burkina Faso, Traoré realized, was being turned into a living laboratory of surveillance. But there was worse. Among the documents were contracts, signed years earlier, connecting the project to private defense firms. These firms specialized in biological control strategies. In one chilling report, a scientist had written, "Potential for population suppression, subject to further testing." Population suppression. It was no longer a theory. It was a weapon. News of the leaked documents spread like wildfire. Though Traoré had not released them, whispers seeped from the palace into the streets. By nightfall, thousands gathered in Ouagadougou, chanting against the mosquito curse. They carried torches, banners, portraits of Sankara. They demanded answers. The air was electric with fury, but also with fear. Mothers wept as they carried sick children to the protest, demanding that the foreigners leave. Young men spoke of burning the labs. The people were awakening, but their rage was dangerous, volatile. International media painted the protests as ignorance. Superstition against science, they declared. Yet footage smuggled out showed something far more chilling. Soldiers, dispersing demonstrators with unusual precision, as if guided. Later, it was discovered some soldiers carried experimental trackers, devices linked to the very mosquito DNA signatures now flowing in the people's blood. Burkina Faso was no longer merely under pressure. It was under siege, betrayal in the shadows, inside the palace. Betrayal slithered closer. One night, a convoy of trucks carrying food aid was stopped at a checkpoint. Inside were not supplies, but sealed canisters filled with live mosquito larvae. The documents with them bore forged signatures. Signatures of Traoré's own ministers. Someone inside his cabinet had already chosen a side. The captain did not rage. He did not shout. He gathered his closest loyalists, those he trusted with his life, and gave quiet orders. The palace would be secured. Communications would be monitored. Every movement of his ministers would be watched. The walls of leadership were closing in. He could feel the ghost of Sankara more than ever, whispering warnings in the silence. Sanctions and starvation. Then came the sanctions. Food imports slowed. Fuel prices doubled overnight. Banks froze accounts. The poorest suffered most. Mothers traded their last jewelry for bags of rice. Fathers walked miles searching for work, only to collapse from exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at the nation like a blade. The foreign press blamed Traoré himself. A reckless leader, blinded by ideology, putting his people at risk. They painted him as an obstacle to progress, a dictator clinging to conspiracy. Yet on the ground, the truth was felt in the stomachs of starving children, in the fields swarmed by altered mosquitoes, in the silence of graves dug too often. Every day his advisors urged him to sign the agreement. Captain, end the suffering. Let them finish the trials. At least we will live. But Traoré's answer was silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though searching for something beyond it, a way forward that did not mean surrender. The impossible choice, one night, as the power grid faltered under rolling blackouts, Traoré stood alone on the balcony of the palace. The city below flickered in darkness. In the distance, he saw torches, villagers marching once again, their chants rising into the sky. He felt the weight of generations pressing on him. The Mosquito Project was more than a health trial. It was a test of Africa itself. If he yielded, his nation would become a laboratory forever. If he resisted, his people would starve under sanctions, perhaps even face invasion masked as humanitarian intervention. Both paths led to suffering. Both paths carried death. And yet, deep within him, a spark refused to die. He remembered Sankara's words, "We must dare to invent the future." As thunder rolled across the skies, Captain Ibrahim Traore clenched his fists. He would not bow. He would not let foreign hands decide the fate of his people. The rising storm had only one direction: confrontation. The gathering storm, the city of Ouagadougou, woke one morning to an eerie silence. Markets stood half-empty. Mosques were quieter than usual. Streets felt abandoned, as though the air itself carried a warning. Rumors had spread overnight. that something monumental was about to happen inside the presidential palace. Foreign envoys had arrived in secret. Their planes touched down at dawn, escorted under heavy guard to the heart of power. They brought with them contracts, agreements, and veiled ultimatums. Today, the decision would be made. Inside the palace, Captain Ibrahim Traore stood in his uniform, unflinching. The eyes of his generals were on him, some filled with loyalty, others with uncertainty. Beyond the palace walls, soldiers patrolled nervously, their rifles glinting under the sun. The people, though barred from the grounds, gathered outside, in swelling numbers, chanting, waiting for the man they called le capitaine du peuple, the people's captain. This was no longer about mosquitoes. It was about sovereignty. The envoys. The envoys entered the chamber like actors rehearsing a role. Their smiles were polite, their words polished, but their eyes betrayed impatience. They placed thick folders on the table, financial packages, promises of aid, scientific assurances. The leader of the delegation, a man with a voice smooth as glass, spoke first. Captain Traoré, the world watches. Sign these agreements, and Burkina Faso will lead Africa into a new age of health. Refuse, and you risk isolation, famine, even war. Which future do you choose for your people? The room hung heavy. Traoré did not answer. Instead, he motioned for the guards to dim the lights. A projector flickered on. The revelation across the wall, images appeared. Pages from the whistleblower's files, patents filed under American and European biotech firms, contracts linking the mosquito program to private defense contractors, diagrams showing mosquito DNA embedded with traceable markers designed to interact with satellites and drones, the generals murmured. The envoys shifted uncomfortably. The people's captain spoke at last, his voice low but firm. You speak of saving lives. But here lies your truth. This is not medicine. This is surveillance. This is control. You would turn my people into specimens, my land into a laboratory, and you dare call it salvation, the envoys protested. Lies, misinterpretations, propaganda. But their voices trembled. The evidence was undeniable. Then, as if on cue, the palace lights flickered. The projector died. Darkness swallowed the room for an instant before the backup power returned. It was enough to confirm what Traoré already suspected. Sabotage had infiltrated his walls. The betrayal gunfire cracked in the distance. Outside, chaos erupted. A column of soldiers broke ranks, storming the gates. They bore the insignia of Burkina Faso, but their orders came from elsewhere. One of the generals had betrayed him. Inside the chamber, one envoy smirked, whispering, "Your own men are against you, Captain. It is over. Sign, and you may yet survive." But Traoré did not flinch. His loyal guards sealed the doors, weapons drawn. The palace had become a fortress, its fate to be decided in fire or faith. The siege for hours, gunfire echoed through the capital. Smoke rose above the palace walls. The people outside, unarmed but unyielding, refused to disperse. They chanted louder, their voices rising above the bullets. "Traoré, Traoré! Burkina is not for sale!" The rebels inside the army pushed, hard, breaching checkpoints. But they underestimated the will of ordinary citizens. Men, women, even children blocked the streets, hurling stones, forming barricades with burning tires. It was not only Traoré they defended, it was their right to exist free of foreign experiments. The decisive move, at the height of the chaos, Traoré made his move. He ordered his most trusted unit to storm the research compound on the city's outskirts, the very facility where the GMO mosquitoes were bred and released. The mission was brutal. Guards loyal to the project fought back fiercely, but the unit pressed forward, smashing through gates, seizing crates of larvae, and torching the laboratories. Flames rose into the night, thick smoke carrying the smell of chemicals and burning metal. In one chamber, they discovered cold storage units filled with vials marked Generation X, prototype. The vials glowed faintly blue under the emergency lights. None of the soldiers dared to touch them. Instead, they destroyed the units completely, ensuring nothing would leave the building alive. When the fire reached its peak, the night sky glowed orange, visible across the city. Crowds erupted in cheers. The symbol of foreign control was gone. The near assassination, but victory came at a cost. As Traoré addressed his people from the balcony of the palace, his voice carrying over megaphones, declaring that Burkina Faso would never be enslaved, by science disguised as mercy. A single shot rang out. The bullet struck the pillar inches from his head, splintering stone. Panic rippled through the crowd. Guards rushed him back inside. The assassin was never captured. Some said he was a mercenary. Others whispered it was one of his own men. But to the people, it did not matter. The attempt had failed. Their captain lived, and his survival felt like destiny. The world reacts by dawn. The news had spread across continents. Footage of burning labs, chanting crowds, and Traoré defying envoys flooded social media. In Africa, it ignited sparks of pride and rebellion. Leaders who had once stayed silent now faced demands from their citizens. If Burkina Faso can resist, why can't we? In the West, outrage mounted. Commentators called Traoré reckless, dangerous, a dictator standing in the way of progress. Some demanded intervention. Yet behind the anger was unease, because for the first time, the narrative of philanthropy had been pierced, and the cracks were visible to all. The captain's oath. That night, exhausted but unbroken, Traoré gathered his loyalists in the palace courtyard. He raised his fist, his voice echoing into the smoke-filled air. They wanted to turn us into specimens. They wanted to own our blood. But we are not theirs to own. We are Africa, and Africa is not for sale. The crowd erupted, their chants rolling like thunder. Not for sale. Not for sale. The climax had been reached. The choice had been made. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traore was no longer just a captain, no longer just a leader. He had become a symbol. Ashes of the lab, the flames of the destroyed mosquito compound smoldered for days, a blackened scar on the edge of Ouagadougou. Acrid smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles, carrying with it the scent of chemicals and burnt metal. For the people, it was a symbol of liberation, the fire that consumed their fears. For the world, it was an act of rebellion, a direct defiance of the global order. Children from nearby villages came to stare at the ruins. Elders whispered prayers, some in gratitude, others in fear of what retaliation might come. Soldiers stood, guard, weary but resolute, their uniforms dusted with ash. And at the heart of it all stood Ibrahim Traore, his figure silhouetted against the rising smoke. To his people, he was no longer merely captain or president. He was the man who had burned the hand that sought to control them. The economic news, but victory came with a price. The next morning, international sanctions tightened like a noose. Western banks froze every Burkina account. Foreign investors fled overnight. Aid shipments were halted. Food prices tripled in a week. Lines stretched outside bakeries and markets, mothers clutching coins that could no longer buy enough to feed their children. Foreign media feasted on the suffering. Headlines screamed, "Traoré dooms his nation," and "Superstition triumphs over science." They painted him as a reckless warlord who had doomed his people for pride. But inside Africa, the story was different. Across Mali, Niger, Guinea, Senegal, and beyond, whispers grew. Burkina Faso has broken the chain. On street corners and in marketplaces, his face appeared on posters. His words, smuggled through recordings, echoed in homes. Africa is not for sale. The humiliation of the powerful in boardrooms, far from Ouagadougou, anger brewed. The Gates Foundation, once untouchable in its reputation, now faced questions it had never imagined. Investigations unearthed old patents, buried contracts, and quiet partnerships with defense industries. Questions once confined to conspiracy forums were now splashed across mainstream outlets. Was the Mosquito project really just about malaria? Why were defense contractors involved in a health initiative? Why were African nations always the testing grounds? Never Europe, never America. For the first time, the image of philanthropy cracked. Gates himself, usually calm in his public appearances, faltered in interviews. His assurances sounded hollow, his laughter forced. The footage of burning labs replayed endlessly, a reminder that even the wealthiest man on earth could not control everything. The people rise in Africa, Traoré's. Defiance lit a fire. Protests erupted across the continent, not against him, but in support. Crowds chanted his name in Dakar, in Bamako, in Accra. Youth movements declared a new era of resistance. In Niger, students marched with banners. If Burkina Faso can stand, so can we. In Ghana, fishermen refused shipments of imported health solutions, demanding sovereignty over their waters. In Nigeria, market women spread recordings of Traoré's speeches, their voices trembling with pride. It was no longer a Burkinabe struggle. It was African. The ghost of Sankara through it. The ghost of Thomas Sankara walked beside Traoré. Murals appeared across Ouagadougou. Sankara's face alongside Traoré's, the words "the dream lives" scrawled beneath. Older generations who had seen Sankara's fall wept openly. They had believed the dream buried forever, but now it stirred again. And younger generations, who had only heard his name in stories, saw in Traoré proof that the spirit of resistance was not history. It was alive. In speeches, Traoré rarely invoked his name directly, but his silence was deliberate. He knew the weight of Sankara's legacy. He carried it, quietly, carefully, as both shield and burden. Retaliation was inevitable. Drones buzzed in the skies. Above Burkina Faso, cyber attacks crippled government servers. Rumors spread of mercenaries gathering in neighboring countries. Every night, the palace lights flickered with the threat of sabotage, but the people rallied closer around their captain. Women formed human shields at protests. Farmers offered food to soldiers without pay. Youth organized watch patrols in their neighborhoods. In every act of solidarity, the message was clear. If he falls, we fall. If he stands, we stand. The harder the outside world pushed, the stronger the people's resolve became. Traoré's transformation, exhaustion weighed on him. His eyes grew darker, his frame thinner. He spent long nights at his desk, pen scratching across papers by candlelight when the electricity failed. Yet even in fatigue, he radiated resolve. Advisors urged him to compromise. Allies warned of assassination. Foreign leaders tempted him with secret deals, offering wealth and safety if he yielded. But each time, his answer was the same: silence, followed by action. One morning, he announced the creation of an African Institute for Sovereign Science, rejecting foreign-controlled labs. It would be funded not by outsiders, but by pooling resources from across sympathetic nations. Scientists who had once been silenced now stepped forward, pledging loyalty to research untainted by foreign interests. It was more than policy. It was defiance written into reality. The question that shook the world, as weeks turned into months, Burkina Faso remained under siege. Hunger persisted, the economy groaned, yet the spirit of the people refused to break. Foreign powers expected collapse, but instead they saw resilience. And then came the moment that would echo across history. Standing before a crowd of thousands in Ouagadougou's main square, with Sankara's mural towering behind him, Ibrahim Traore lifted the Burkinabe flag high. His voice carried through the loudspeakers, rough but unyielding. They told us we were too small to resist. They told us science belonged to them. They told us our blood was theirs to own. But we are not theirs. We are Africa, and Africa does not bow. The crowd roared. Some wept. Others fell to their knees. Across the continent, televisions and radios broadcast the moment live. And then came his final words, a question that silenced even the loudest cheers. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains? The words hung in the air like thunder, echoing beyond Burkina Faso, beyond Africa, across the world. The silence. After the storm, when the lab's ashes had long cooled, when the sanctions had hardened into daily struggle, when the speeches faded into memory, there remained silence. Not a silence of defeat, but of resilience. Burkina Faso still stood. The world had expected collapse. They had written their reports, drafted their obituaries for Traoré's revolution. They had bet on famine, on rebellion, on despair. And yet, months later, the Burkinabe flag still waved above the palace, ragged but undefeated. That silence unsettled the powerful more than any battle could, the fracturing of certainty. The incident in Burkina Faso cracked something deeper than policy. For decades, the certainty of the West had rested on an invisible assumption, that Africa would always bend, always absorb, always accept. Traoré shattered that. Across parliaments in Europe, debates turned bitter. Was their grip on Africa slipping? In Washington, think tanks scrambled for answers, papers warning of a new Sankarist wave and the risk of sovereign contagion. In Geneva, health conferences no longer spoke with the same confidence about test zones in Africa. Every proposal now carried the shadow of Burkina Faso. And at the center of this global unease stood one man in a red beret. The man and the myth to his people, Ibrahim Traore became more than president. He became myth. Mothers told their children stories of the night the mosquitoes burned. Elders carved his likeness into wood and stone. Graffiti painted him as a lion, as fire, as the unyielding sun. His speeches circulated underground in countries where governments tried to ban them. He was flesh and blood, still walking, still eating, still exhausted. Yet in the minds of millions, he had crossed the boundary into legend. Like Che, like Sankara, like Lumumba, but different. He had not been cut down in his prime. He was living his legend in real time, and that made him dangerous. The price of defiance, but legends are born of sacrifice. Burkina Faso's economy bled under sanctions. Children still went to bed hungry. Parents still wondered how long their courage could outlast their pain. Traoré carried this weight visibly. Each public appearance showed deeper lines on his face, each speech slower, heavier. He was not blind to the suffering. He felt it in his own family, his own soldiers, his own bones. Yet when questioned, his answer remained, "Better to suffer free than to live fat in chains." The world replayed this phrase endlessly, sometimes to mock, sometimes to admire. But in Africa, it became scripture. A continent awakens. Then came the spark. In Mali, soldiers stormed a foreign-funded lab rumored to be testing crops resistant to local seeds. In Nigeria, a coalition of farmers blocked shipments of foreign pesticides. In Senegal, fishermen rejected sustainable nets distributed by Western NGOs, nets that made them dependent on imported gear. Each act traced back to one example. Burkina Faso news anchors called it the Traoré effect. Scholars debated whether it was nationalism or desperation, but in the villages and cities of Africa, it was simpler. It was courage. Shadows in the dark, and yet with every flame of hope came shadows. Whispers of assassins followed him. A convoy bomb narrowly missed his motorcade. Mysterious diseases appeared in villages near the border, raising fears of silent retaliation. Foreign mercenaries were spotted moving across the Sahel at night. Traoré lived under constant threat. His guards doubled, his circle tightened, his sleep shortened. Yet he refused exile, refused the luxury of safe houses abroad. He remained among his people, even if it meant dying with them. That stubbornness only deepened his legend. Beyond Africa, but his message did not stop at Africa's shores. In Latin America, students carried his face alongside Bolivar and Chavez. In Asia, activists invoked his speeches in protests against corporate exploitation. Even in Europe, small groups of disillusioned youth whispered his name, seeing in him the defiance they craved in their own leaders. The world had made him a villain. But in making him a villain, they had also made him a symbol, and symbols cross borders faster than armies. The last speech one night, after months of silence, Traoré returned to the public square in Ouagadougou. The crowd was enormous, tens of thousands packed shoulder to shoulder, their voices a low thunder. He did not speak long. His words were brief, weary, but carved into memory. They tried to own our air, our food, our blood. We told them no. And, if tomorrow they come for more, we will tell them no again. Because a nation is not a laboratory. A people are not experiments. Africa is not theirs. Africa is ours. The crowd erupted, some screaming, some weeping, some standing in stunned silence. That night, the recording spread faster than any speech before it. Within days, it had reached every continent, the seed of tomorrow. And then, the story blurred into destiny. Children born in that year grew up not remembering the hunger, but the fire. Not the sanctions, but the courage. They learned of a captain who had stood against one of the richest men alive and said no. They repeated his words in schools, painted them on walls, sang them in songs. The mosquitoes became myth, no longer insects, but symbols of chains burned away. And the man who burned them became more than a man. The unanswered question history does not give answers quickly. Decades may pass before the truth of that moment is written. But already the question he left behind lingers. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains? No historian can answer it yet. Perhaps the chains still hold, perhaps they are only loosening. Perhaps the world will try again, with new tools, new tricks, new forms of control, but perhaps, just perhaps, something shifted that cannot be reversed. The final image is not of fire, nor of war, nor of hunger. It is of a man in a red beret, standing before his people, his face half-shadowed, half-lit. Behind him, a mural of Sankara. Around him, the cries of his people. Above him, the night sky stretching endlessly, as if Africa itself were watching. And in that, silence. The world feels it. The tremor of something unstoppable, the birth of a story that will not die.